Hello and welcome to Apache Karaf Essentials. I'm Jamie Goodyear. Today we're going to talk about Blueprint. This talk's going to be a little quick. We want to give you a bit of an introduction to Blueprint and tell you why it is you'd use it. If you've been following us since our bundle activator video, you'll know that when you start up a bundle in Apache Karaf, it has a special class we're looking inside of the jar called the bundle activator, and it contains a start, stop, and some updating for any managed service. It's a lot of boiler code, and a lot of developers find this a bit tedious to maintain. So what we have is the Blueprint spec, which allows us to get a little bit of an easier time working with OSGi. Let's dig in. So the spec was put into OSGi around the time Compendium 4.2, so it's been around for quite some time. Karaf uses the Apache Aries implementation of the Blueprint container, and all this thing is really responsible for is being able to read Blueprint XML, very similar to Spring XML, instantiating any of the components, the beans, wiring them together, registering our services we want in the container, and looking up any service reference that exists in our container to wire into our objects. Let's take a quick look at our Blueprint file. So inside of our Blueprint, again, very similar to Spring, all we have in here is the ability to say, this is our container. We set an ID, so we can optionally say, hey, we have this container or that container, and identify them quickly. We can set up a dependency change and say, hey, this container depends on another one before we start updating and running these pieces of software. And we have an activation. The activation tells the system, do I want to let this set of code sit here, and when we need it, set it up in a JVM and get it running, or just immediately get this code up and running and instantiated into the JVM. When we're creating our beans, we take standard Java, so we have that here in the top corner of our screen, and when we put it into Blueprint, we just create a bean, we give it a little identifier, say which class the code comes from, we can pass in any arguments and set properties on the object as per usual. We can pass in references or values. So values are going to be things like text, numbers, Boolean values. References will be more complex things like objects or service references that we need for our object. We can create the instance factory pattern. You would create your standard Java factory pattern with some kind of a create method. In the Blueprint, you'll have your Java bean instantiated, and then you'll be able to call the factory references. So in this case, we'll have, hey, I want to create another bean that's going to call my account factory. I'm going to use the factory method of create account, pass in a set of arguments and properties, and be able to get my objects that way created. Similarly, in the static instance factory pattern, we just have the one bean we create that calls a static factory, saying what the create method is, and pass any arguments or properties as required. We can set on our beans a scope. So the scope's going to say, do I want to have a singleton of this object, or do I have a prototype scenario where I have multiple instances, different instances of that object being created? We can also set up the lifecycle callbacks. So this is a little bit similar to what we did in a bundle activator, but instead of having that code in a bundle activator separate from our objects, we put into our object or service the methods, where we're going to name it in this case init and destroy, to wire directly into our Blueprint to say, hey, I want to, on creation of this object, the init, do this set of code. And when I take down this object, I want to call the destroy method. And in our case, I'm calling it destroy. And that's going to do effectively the same thing as like a stop method. This allows us some hooks in there to say, this is my initialization, and this is my taking things apart and releasing all those resources. We can also set up in here the publish and consume OSGi services. So this is a really important part here. In the top corner, you can see we have a account impl, which is just saying, hey, here's a object called an account. This is the implementation of it. And we have a service that takes this particular implementation and publishes on the interface. So we're saying, hey, we have a service that provides an account. And in a different Blueprint, we're able to set up a client that's going to be the thing that wants to use that service. And it's going to get a reference from the JVM saying, I want something that implements the account. It sees that, and at runtime, it'll get wired in, and then the bean will be able to take that reference to that account service and wire it together. That way we can have two different bundles, one being a service provider and our one being the consumer, and they're able to be joined together, and we don't have to do that in the bundle activators. Another little piece here, when you're taking a look at that reference, that's called a reference manager. We can also add on to it timeouts or availability. And what that really means is to say, hey, the service that we need for this bundle to start up, it may not be there in the first 10 seconds of the JVM booting. Maybe it will take 30 seconds for things to become available. Or maybe we don't need to have that service absolutely all the time. So we can give a little bit of a hint to the system to say, we need you to not be as strict, and we can wait, give a little bit of grace time before we pick up those resources. Another little piece that we can do in here is add in registration listeners. So we use this pattern when we say, I've installed an application and I want it to listen to my container. And when it gets particular events, it's want to be able to say, hey, I want to do a little bit of an operation here. I'm going to listen to what's going on, and if I see something happening on this container, I want to react to it. Perhaps I'm seeing plugins coming in, I want to do some work. Perhaps I'm seeing a service go away, and because I see something's going away, I want to do something else in another service. So there's a hook that allows us to see more about the dynamic nature of our services. Okay, we've done a lot of very quick slides here, and I realize that's a lot to interpret real quick. So let's go back into the code. And this will get a little easier once we get into the software side of this. Okay, so let's take a look quickly at a very simple service implementation. This is a simple Blueprint bundle package. So we see it's a bundle, and we have our familiar Maven bundle plugin. And this one has been set up with no bundle activator. What we will see in here in our regular Java package, we have an interface for something called my service, which is a very simple thing that just has an echo string that goes into it. And the implementation that implements the service, it says, hey, give me a string, and I'm just going to spit out that string directly to you. Here's the part we're interested in. We have in the resources folder an OSGi inf blueprint directory. Inside of there, there's a Blueprint XML. We call it my service in this case. In this file, we have created a service bean for our my service impulse. That's the concrete implementation of our interface, and we publish to the OSGi system the interface my service using the reference of that bean. Okay, great. So we can now go in and we can build this, just make sure it's built, and I can fire up a local Karaf. Let me just start up this Karaf. This is one I've been using before to make sure it's all ready to go. And we're going to try installing Maven and com.safor. And I always have to go get the package name because I can never type these out. .blueprint / blueprint. And we'll see that we have a service that's here. We can now do a resolve on 53. And we see that it didn't load. What happened here? If we do headers on that bundle, we are going to see that we are missing Blueprint. What we have to do is we have to install the Aries Blueprint. So let me just do Aries Blueprint. Now, didn't I just say that this is what we chose to use in Karaf? Yes, it is what we chose to use in Karaf. However, we don't by default put it in the container. That's optional. You can put it in there. What people will typically use is something like declarative services as our option. Of course, you'll have to do a feature install of SCR to get that. So let's retry setting up our bundle again. Let's do a resolve on 53. And now, it sees that it has the dependency it needs on the blueprint. So we should be able to start it. So start 53. And there we go. We have that up and running service that's in there. If I do a service list and grep for my service, we can see that we have an instance of it running in there. Okay, that's pretty cool, but we also want to know what about the client side of this. So let's go over to the client piece of code, and I'll go over to my other running IDE. We can see we have a separate bundle, and this one is picking up as a dependency the my service jar, and we have no bundle activator in here. We have a client that it's going to want to get a reference to that service and just say hello. It's going to pass in a word and expect something to get printed out. Let's go and take a look at the blueprint. We can see we have a bean for my client going right to here to our local code, and it wants a reference to a service bean that implements my service. Let's build this code, and we are going to put that into our running Karaf. Let's go over here, and I'm going to swap us back to the other running terminal so we can see this. We can see in here we have our Karaf. And I'm going to do an install. And I always got to go grab that that set of string to do com.savoir. And I got to grab the part from here, Karaf instincts.pp /wiki/p. And now we have the next bundle has been made available. We can resolve it, 68. And we can do a list. We can see it's resolved. And then we can do a start, 68. And with that, we have both sets of bundles are up and running. So now we have both of these bundles installed, but where's the output? We should have seen a hello world. What ended up happening was that in the client, the activation was set to lazy. The client side will only load when someone requires it. Since the only one requiring is itself, we're going to have to set this thing over to eager. So let's set this to eager and rebuild this part. And I'm going to switch back over to our other terminal, and I'm going to do an update on that last bundle. And now we see that the hello world gets picked up and processed and passed along. Let's head back to our slides. So the last topic I want to talk with you guys about is ConfigAdmin and how that works with Blueprint. So in our previous video, we used the bundle activator and manually hook that into ConfigAdmin to be able to read a configuration file in the Karaf Etsy folder. And whenever it got updated, it would update our software. Under Blueprint, the way we accomplish this is to introduce the ConfigAdmin namespace, which we can see here at the top of the file here. That is Blueprint CM. And that will set up a small set of elements that we can set a persistent ID, telling it this is the file we want to use, set an update strategy, in our case reload whenever we change the configuration, and set up a set of default properties. We have to give a title for the property and a default value for each of them. Then in any application code we want to write, so we set up some beans, we can say, hey, I want to use that named property and give me the dynamic value of whatever ConfigAdmin has at the moment for our app. Let's take a look at this in the code. So let's have our Gander in IDE. We can see this piece of code here is basically the same thing we had done for our bundle activator, but in this case, we only have the sample code, identical to the prior video, and now we have our Blueprint XML. In the Blueprint XML, we set up the ConfigAdmin. We say we're going to have a file called ConfigApp with a update strategy of reload. We set up a port and URL with some default values, and we tell our sample code to use the configured values. Let's build this up. And in our Etsy folder, let's take a look. I already have the file that's created. So let's go to config.config. And I'm going to change the default ports to start at the beginning with 222 just to show that we're starting off with some fresh values. And let's install our Blueprint ConfigAdmin file. We install it. Let's take a look. Do we see it's here? Yep. Let's resolve it. And let's start this bundle. And what we're going to see is that it constructed it originally on the first port. That's the port that's in the code, its internal default value, and immediately updated it to our configured value, which is 2222. If I go back into the config, I can change this up, and let's make this very clear. So I'm going to put this to 333 and write that out. And as soon as I write that out, we should see on this side, it gets picked up and immediately gets applied to our running code. So it's pretty slick and pretty quick for how that works. So we've now simplified our code by removing the bundle activator and all of the boilerplate code that goes inside of that with Blueprint, which simplifies things for developers because you don't really need to know all those details now. That being said, our time for Blueprint is up for today. Our next video, we want to talk about declarative services. Thank you again for tuning in and see you next time. Cheers.